Welcome to Big City, Small Town, the weekly podcast all about San Antonio and the people who make it go and grow. I'm your host, Bob Rivard. This week's guest is Ronald Davis, Curator of American History at the Witte Museum, a position he has held since January 2023. Davis is the co-curator of Black Cowboys, An American Story, the exhibition currently at the Witte Museum and running through February 2025. For those of us who grew up watching Westerns on television and at the movie theater, it might come as a surprise to learn that 1 in 4 cowboys on the cattle trails in the 19th century were black. Hollywood somehow missed that in its many fictional films and primetime television offerings. The exhibit, which I highly recommend, explores the lives and work of the numerous black men, women, and children, both enslaved and free, who labored on the ranches of Texas and participated on cattle drives before the Civil War through the turn of the 20th century. Ronald Davis, welcome to Big City, Small Town.
It's a pleasure to be here, Bob.
We asked you to come on the podcast now for two timely reasons. First, to promote a really worthy and original exhibition, Black Cowboys, An American Story. Second, to tell our listeners about the 2024 Conference on Texas at the Witte Museum, which occurs every year. This year, the conference will be a 2-day symposium on December 5th and 6th, exploring the foundational role of chattel slavery in the formation and growth of Texas. But first, let's talk about Black Cowboys, An American Story.
Yeah, so as you know, Annette appears.
Annette appears.
I had a chance. She was introduced to some of the scholars at UT at a department meeting, and they mentioned my research to her on enslaved cowboys in Texas. And we were able to set up a meeting, and Ms. Pierce made sure I understood American history thoroughly. Let's just say it that way. We talked on the phone for approximately an hour and a half of her asking me questions. And actually, they were such really thoughtful and intentional and pointed questions that I thoroughly enjoyed the conversation and her curiosity. And so after that conversation, again, this is maybe the late spring, early summer of 2020.
And you, Ronald, if I can just jump in, are a doctoral student at the University of Texas at Austin. And so This research was part of your doctorate.
Yes, it's a part of my dissertation.
Okay.
And so we arranged to meet with Maurice McDermott and Bruce Shackelford. And so this is probably now in the early fall of 2020. And we walk in the door, and, we introduce ourselves. And I know Bruce Shackelford because I've read his work. He's a fantastic scholar of the West. And we said, hey, we would love to do an exhibit. And without skipping a beat, Maurice and Bruce said, we're on. Let's do it.
And Maurice at the time was the longtime CEO of the Witte Museum.
Yes.
Built it into its current status.
Yes. Amazing woman in her own right.
Right.
And did such amazing work for the Witte and at the Witte. And just making space for the community to come in and have conversations is something that I've subsequently learned that she was that she found very important to the Witte. And so, then the pandemic hits, and we formed this really amazing steering committee of community members. And in those meetings, we had to tackle the tough conversations, right, that the community members had. And we were able to work with them in particular to develop a very strong concept statement. And we adhered to the concept statement that the community gave us, right? It was a mandate from the community to do this exhibit. And so I work with very closely with Michelle Everidge, Dr. Michelle Everidge, and who's the Director of Operations, and Beth Stricker, the Chief Creative Officer at the Witte. They were then at the time, and it was such an amazing experience. We were finishing each other's sentences as we were getting the exhibit ready, as we were writing label copy, and
Where did you find everything, Ronald, to assemble that exhibit? Because I personally was surprised that there's so much physical evidence of that time period, and yet it's something that's missing in the pages of Texas history.
And and it's a funny thing is that there are some scholarly articles that are written about the Black Cowboy experience, but not that many, especially not that much as far as that definitely makes it out into the public. There's a few scholars that look at enslaved cowboys, Deborah Lyles being one of them, but there's just not that much research into it. And to be honest, I think it has to do with how young the study of slavery in Texas is. There were scholars who wrote about it, in the early 20th century, but I think some of the social history aspects of Texas slavery doesn't really get started until the 80s. And so there's so much to explore about Texas. And that's one of the reasons why we're doing the conference, is because we understand as an institution that this is information that we want all Texans to know, all Americans to know, so we can understand our past better.
The exhibition's been open for a while. What's the reception been?
It's been so overwhelmingly positive that it's hard for me to quantify as a curator. But I know that when people are in the exhibit, if they are moved, a lot of times our admission staff, our mission team will call me and say, hey, there's people here and they want to talk to you about the exhibit. And I'm fortunate enough to be around, and it's amazing to hear people say, I see myself in this museum, or that's my uncle, right? And to see little kids with the joy on their faces because they get to see someone who looks like them in the museum. One time, Tex Williams, who's one of the people who we feature in the exhibit when we talk about rodeos, he was there for the second opening, and we were talking, and I've gotten to know him pretty well. And he said to me, Ron, I never thought I'd see myself in a museum. Right here, this man he's one of the most highly decorated Black Cowboys there is in the National Cowboy and Western Hall of Fame in Oklahoma City. And yet he didn't think he would see himself in the museum. And that's the kind of work that the exhibit does. It really gives space for these untold stories to come to light. And the Witte is committed to doing that kind of work.
Are there a lot of families today in Texas, Ron, that understand their ancestors were Black Cowboys, whether they were free or enslaved, or that their families did have members that accompanied cattle trails from Texas up to Kansas?
Yes, there's a strong tradition of Black Cowboys, especially as you go east of San Antonio into Fort Bend County, Liberty County. There's a strong tradition there in particular, but in other places like out in Victoria as well, there's a strong tradition of Black Cowboys. And these people understand their heritage and their history. I mean, it's one of the reasons why we have what some people call the shadow circuit. It's a rodeo circuit of Black rodeos that runs from East Texas all the way up into Oklahoma. And they've been around. I mean, there's different lengths of time, but they've been these places where Black people show off their skills as rodeo performers for decades. And they trace their lineage back to enslaved cowboys.
Well, I said earlier in our conversation that I highly recommended the exhibition. I'd go farther than that and say it's actually a very important exhibition. Many of our listeners may not realize that oftentimes when you go to an area museum and you see a major exhibition, it's something that's traveling from museum to museum, and it might have originated on the East Coast or West Coast or somewhere else. But this is an exhibition that was born in our city. Mm-hmm. It's about our region and the larger state. And I hope that not only do people appreciate it here at the Witte, but it would be a shame if it didn't travel beyond our city.
Well, it actually is traveling. Once it closes in February at the Witte, it's traveling out to the Autry Museum of the West in LA. And it's going to be there for about 6 to 8 months. And that's a major Western. That may be the major Western museum, actually, yes. And so it's going there. And we've worked really closely with their team to kind of get, merge like the stories that they're telling about Black husbandry and herdsmanship in California with Texas. And those stories are connected through migration from Texas to California. But after that, it goes to Kalamazoo, Michigan. And it's going to be there for a while. And people are just constantly inquiring about the exhibit because we do understand its importance. It's forcing people to reimagine what they understood the cowboy to be, right? The cowboy was an inclusive figure, but it was made into an iconic figure. But in making it an iconic figure, it seems like there were certain narratives that were removed from the story.
Well, I think for all of us who love and appreciate history, Texas history in this instance, understanding that it's a constantly evolving narrative that needs to be improved, corrected, deepened, is really critically important. And that's happening in our city at many levels. Certainly, the conversation about slavery in Texas is a relatively contemporary conversation. It's not something that everyone grew up with here. That was more of a Deep South conversation where it was happening, but long overdue for it to happening here. I want to credit Annette Pierce for her leadership in bringing the symposium to San Antonio at a time when there's growing interest in the history of slavery here. As the state and the city and the Alamo Trust undertake the $500 million transformation of the Alamo Plaza, and all the efforts underway to correct and deepen that long-standing narrative, particularly of the 1836 Battle of the Alamo, which I believe, highly mythologized the Anglo defenders while dishonoring the Mexican troops sent here under the command of General Santa Anna to defend, after all, what at the time what was Mexican sovereign territory. So there's a lot going on there. The museum, we've just broken ground on. There's a new education center opening up there next year, I believe. Tell me about the symposium, Ron, and how that came about and what will take place here early next month.
Yeah, so that's a great story. But one of the things I think that I really appreciate about the Witte is that they're committed to sharing untold stories, right? And so one of the ways that we do that is through what we call deep time. And that's telling the stories of the past from millions of years ago, 10,000s of years ago to the present, right? And that commitment means that we are going to tell all the stories of Texas history. And so that's really how this conference is born, is because we are committed to making sure that we tell the stories that weren't told before. And so that's kind of how this thing was born. And it's born through this conversation that the Witte was continually having, right? There was the success of the Black Cowboys exhibit, and we were continually talking, and people were asking questions about slavery in Texas and why didn't we learn this? What can we do as a museum to make sure that we are contributing to this, contributing to the understanding of the history of Texas and discussing slavery. And we really realized, and then with the help of Miss Pierce, of course, really pushing us to talk more about slavery openly, we realized that it was necessary to do a conference that centered the enslaved experience in Texas. And so that's how the conference comes into being, is just this understanding that as a museum, we have a responsibility to ensure that we are passing on an accurate view and history of Texas past. And we understand that you really can't talk about the history of Texas in the 19th century without talking about the institution of chattel slavery.
Ron, tell me, in your opinion, how important the perpetuation of slavery was to individuals that were fighting for Texas independence and were at the Battle of the Alamo. And I've read Andrew Torgett's Seeds of Empire, which is a critically acclaimed view. And I've also read maybe the more controversial Forget the Alamo book that came out a year or two ago. How much emphasis should we put on the resistance, the revolution being about opposing abolitionists in Mexico and its government and its decision to end slavery?
So when I look at African American history, I look at it as a way to better understand American history. It's a lens through which to view American history. And so when I think about slavery in Texas, right, I think about slavery as it goes back to New Spain, right? And so one of the things that we do in the exhibit is show that there were enslaved cowboys and free Black cowboys in Mexico working in the Caribbean in the 16th century and the 17th century, coming up through with the Spanish, coming up and settling and being part of the original Spanish settlement of this region, right? And so this story that we're telling, this story about the conference is a broader story. It's a story about all the parts, all the aspects of Texas, of slavery in Texas. And we want to make sure that we are talking about the experience of the enslaved, right? So we're not centering enslavers, we're centering the enslaved. We're talking about what it was like to be a mother, what it was like to be a father. What does a bill of sale mean, right? When we see a bill of sale, what does that actually mean? It's an economic instrument, right? It's something that someone says that I give all my interest, right, title and interest to such and such. But when you center the enslaved person in that bill of sale, what do you come to understand? You come to understand that bill of sale means family separation, right? That means that they are separated from their family. And coming to Texas for so many enslaved people was the separation of them from their family, from their kinfolk. And so we're telling the story through this lens of the African American experience. And so that's what we're focused on. We're focused on that, on bringing that understanding. Like, what does it mean to resist? Dr. Michaela Ardain from New Jersey, she's going to talk about resistance and what it meant to run away and what were the things that an enslaved person had to think about when they ran away. Like, you don't just wake up one day and say, I'm going to run north without a plan. So you have to have an understanding of the topography. Where can you get water? Can I steal a horse? How is this going to work? And so she's going to talk about that experience. So we're really centering the enslaved life, what it was like to be an enslaved cowboy, what it meant to pick cotton, to work on sugar plantations. Texas was number 2 in the production of sugar after Louisiana. We don't talk about that. We have a whole cotton bowl, but don't realize that the importance of cotton in Texas is because enslaved people picked it. All right, so this is what we're really trying to accomplish in this conference, is that we're ensuring that we're talking about this broad history of Texas, and that slavery is so intertwined into the 19th century in Texas that you can't overlook it anywhere. And that's there's 2 things I would really like for people to take away from the conference. The humanity of enslaved people. They were not just automatons working on a plantation picking cotton. They were coopers, they were tanners, they were carpenters, they were blacksmiths. And yes, sometimes they picked cotton. They milked cows, right? They woke up in the morning and they had to milk the cows before they went to pick cotton. Or they had to pick cotton when they had to milk the cows after the end of the day of picking cotton. If you were an enslaved child, you were expected to work as soon as you were strong enough to stand up. This is what we want people to understand that the enslaved experience was, is that there was slavery in Galveston, there was slavery in cities, there was slavery in plantations. And how were they similar? How were they different? How did the law affect slavery? What was the law? What was the Texas Constitution's stance on slavery? And that tells us a lot about what the people in power thought was important. And so we're focusing on that story, that broad story of Texas's past.
As Andrew Torgett so eloquently writes in Seeds of Empire, the state's first economy was a cotton economy, basically centered in what we would call East Texas today. And it was utterly dependent on slavery to make it go.
Yeah.
And people coming into the state very much supported a continuation of that reality. And that is fundamental to the fight for Texas independence from Mexico at the time. Do you think that is taught adequately in Texas public schools?
The battle for independence or just slavery in general? Because I feel a little bit uncomfortable with speaking about what educators do in their classrooms, but I do feel like 100% of students in Bexar County come to the Witte. And I think what's important is that we have this conference and we ensure that we tell the story of Texas's past the way that it should be told, and the way that it is taught, the way that historians talk about it. So the way that Torgett talks about it, the way that Donna Emery Berry talks about it, and her research on the value of enslaved bodies from the womb to the grave, and Annette Gordon-Reed and how she'll explain the importance of Juneteenth and what does Juneteenth mean to Texans and what does it mean to the nation and what does it represent. And I think those are the things that I want educators to take away from the conference as they come. Right? We do have quite a bit of scholarships. We actually have about 100 and they're almost full. And so there is this desire to learn it. We're almost sold out, actually. The conference is almost completely sold out at this point. So there is this hunger for this understanding of Texas's past and slavery. But I think it's important to understand this broader context that, yes, slavery was important from the moment of Anglo colonization in Texas. There's no way around that. They wrote about it that way. They talked about it that way. So yeah, it was important, but it's important all the way through, right? There's a reason why they signed the Articles of Secession in 1861. So we're talking about this entire history of antebellum Texas and the Anglo settlement of Texas, not just one specific event.
I want you to talk a little bit about Annette Gordon-Reed, who's the keynote speaker and herself is a Pulitzer Prize-winning historian and writer, most famously for her book, The Hemmings of Monticello, Thomas Jefferson's relationship with a Black woman, Sally Hemings, and children that he had with her, and how long it took for that story to be told in the American narrative, but also her highly praised book on Juneteenth more recently. And so she's a real headliner.
She is, and getting her to, we understood how important the conference was, but when she agreed that she wanted to participate in one way or another, and at the very beginning, we knew that scholars had buy-in, right? Because she's from Texas. And her deciding that she wanted to be a part of this conference let us know that we were on the right track in the beginning. Let us know that we were that this was something that was really important, right? And I drove up to Austin and because she was speaking there, and I went to her talk, and at the end of her talk, I'm like, she's on the stage, I'm in the crowd, and I have her sign my On Juneteenth book. And I said, hey, Dr. Gordon-Reed, we're doing a conference on the history of slavery in Texas. We would love for you to participate. And she wasn't sure who I was. That's fair. But she definitely said, I'm interested. And so I was able to get in touch with her people, and she understands why we need to do this conference and why we need to speak frankly about it. And so her commitment meant that other scholars saw this conference as serious, so that now we have coming to the Witte, coming to San Antonio, a list of the top scholars in history for 2 days at the Witte Museum. I was talking with my colleague, Dr. Marcel Everidge, and we were sitting there looking at each other and looking at this lineup and saying, I don't think there's been a conference with these scholars all in the same room at the same time, talking about their specialty in this way, geared towards a public audience, making sure that the facts are broken down succinctly for everybody to get. And it's just such a powerful thing to be able to be a part of.
That's exciting. You mentioned earlier conference attendees. How many people will be at the conference? And you said there were a few tickets left. So if listeners want to jump on real quickly and see if they can attend, how do they go about doing that?
Yeah, you go to our website, wittemuseum.org/conference. Our maximum was about 400, and I think we're in the middle, 300, 330, 320, somewhere around there. So they're going fast. And we have scholarships, and we encourage educators and students to apply. We'll do everything we can, but we're running short on those too.
Well, the conference will be of interest to so many more people than 300 or 400 people. Mm-hmm. Will the Witte be videoing all these presentations and placing them online for people to access a little bit later on?
Thank you for asking that question. Yes, every panel will be recorded and they'll be able to access it. But we're also, the conference is doing so much more too. We're going to Ms. Pierce is going to do a talk at the lunch on the first day about Black art and its depiction of slavery in Texas. We're going to have Dr. Kimberlyn Montford do a selection of some spirituals, and we're going to have Vincent Hardy, who is a professor at St. Philip's. He's going to perform a speech by Frederick Douglass. Right. One of the very fun things about that is, Frederick Douglass, because he was becoming an outspoken abolitionist, has to flee overseas for a little while, just to kind of stay safe. So
I didn't know that chapter of his life.
Yes, just so he's not kidnapped and brought back into slavery, and he ends up in Ireland for a little while. And in 1846, he delivers a speech in Belfast, Ireland, on the problem with the annexation of Texas. And so we've taken that speech and we haven't added any words to it. We just edited it down, and Vincent Hardy is going to perform it. And powerful. So we're also trying to incorporate the arts in our understanding of African American history. On Friday, the House of Glitter dance troupe is going to do several performances that both engage the Black past and is kind of a call to movement. And we wrap up the conference with a call to action. What are we San Antonians now going to do with this information? How are we going to take this information and spread it, whatever that means to you, an individual? So I think this conference is not just about learning. It's also about what's next steps. How do we ensure that this information continues to roll forward? For some students that come, it may mean that they become a history major and want to study a new part of the African American experience. That is important, as well as the person who says, I want to go out and be an activist, or the person that says, I want to become a teacher now. I want to teach this information. There's no wrong way to activate your activism. And so we're just hoping that people will come, they'll absorb this information. And then when we have a conversation about what's next, they understand that they can do what's best for them. That's what's next.
Do you think the exhibition, which of course is ephemeral, will change the permanent collection and presentation of Texas history at the Witte? Will there be more incorporation of the Black experience as a result of this?
100%. We are focused on telling untold stories. And I think the way that we do that best is by reaching out to our communities and having them involved in the creation and formation of the exhibits. So we do our steering committees and we take those seriously. And every steering committee member is as proud as I am for that exhibit, and the staff are for that exhibit, because they were part of its creation as well.
And this question may be outside your purview at the Witte, but do you see San Antonio eventually having an accredited African American History Museum?
Well, absolutely. We actually have the San Antonio African American Community Archiving Museum, who was one of our partners as well as the Smithsonian, and they already have a place at La Villita where they do tours and talk about San Antonio's African American history. They are actively collecting African American objects and oral histories. And so we do have an African American museum in San Antonio.
But do you see the day when they perhaps are in more permanent location and it's more of a draw for both locals and visitors than it is today?
I think in the next couple of years, they just recently brought the Crest Building, which is a powerful thing. They can tell their story definitely better than I can, but I can tell you that I've been at community charrettes with SACAM, and I've had people say, I'm going to get the chance to step into the building that when I was a child, I could not. And I think that's a powerful statement to be made and to be heard. And so I think I don't know for sure their timeline, but yes, we have a museum already that's dedicated to African American history, and that's doing a very good job at ensuring that history is preserved, protected, and shared.
So, our time is short, but I want to ask you about contemporary politics in Texas and how that influences your work or affects it. We're a deeply divided nation, as we saw in the last presidential election that just concluded. Texas, of course, is a deeply red state. Do you or your colleagues experience pushback from conservative white groups or individuals or find influential donors at the Witte objecting to the exhibition and events like the Symposium that address these important issues?
We at the Witte, we ensure that everything we do is grounded in primary sources, right? So when it is Hector Basie telling his story, because he wrote his autobiography, it's not me telling you what I think he said. He's telling you exactly what he said and what he felt. And so because we are grounded in primary sources, we haven't actually seen those kinds of things happen. And our steering committee members ensure that we do that. Our board of directors is extremely supportive, our staff. And so I can say that it's our methodology that means that we're doing things the way they should be done by standing by those primary sources. And when it's someone else telling their story, there's not much to argue with. There's just not much to argue with. And because we operate with this understanding that there has to be a compassion and an empathy with how we tell these stories and how we exhibit these stories and how we share this information, that's what ultimately matters. That's what really matters, is that our fidelity to the sources is what we strive for. And so we're not thinking about those types of things. We are doing what is right as historians, as scholars, as a museum professional. And we're operating by those things, those rules, those guidelines.
Well, I hope everyone in San Antonio, Ron, regardless of their political orientation or beliefs, will take the time to go to the Witte Museum and see Black Cowboys, An American Story. It's an exhibition that you should, and I'm sure you are, very proud of, and it's great to see it in San Antonio and originate in San Antonio and move beyond there. And then the Symposium, for the very few seats that are still left, if listeners are listening on December 5th and 6th, I think is going to be a groundbreaking event and one I look forward to attending.
I do want to reiterate, I really want students and educators and the public to come. So we're short on tickets. If you hear this, please stop by the Witte's website, come by, purchase a ticket. Educators, students, we have scholarships available. Please come by. We would love to see you there. We would love for you to be a part of this conference, not just attend it, but be a part of the conference.
Ronald Davis, thanks for coming on to Big City, Small Town.